There are all these interesting elements that I think the mainstream account just doesn't even look at. Because you're able to work on these multiple registers, it's bringing in a much more complicated picture.
Just as any social formation must channel its desiring production, so must any any social formation must channel its violence.
Hello, I'm Andrew Culp, the director of the Aesthetics and Politics graduate program at the California Institute of the Arts. And I'm so excited to be invited by John Protevi to discuss his new book, Regimes of Violence. For those not familiar with John, he's published extensively, including a whole series of books with the University of Minnesota Press, including Political Affect, Life, War, and Earth, Edges of the State, and now Regimes of Violence. And he's been teaching at Louisiana State University as a professor of French studies and philosophy. So, John, thanks again. And why don't you give us a little snapshot and overview of the book and the project?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm really glad to be here with you. And as we've mentioned a few times, it's really great to have the dark Deleuze guy and me. I'm kind of a joyous affirmation Deleuze guy, but I think we also overlap much more than those that preliminary opposition would let on. I think the readership for the book is really going to be theory people. I do intervene in debates in evolutionary anthropology, mostly in this book. And in previous books, I've gotten into cognitive science and geography in some other ways. So I do try to look at the way in which Deleuze and Guattari, who are my major theoretical reference points, how they can open up discussion in ongoing debates in specialist sciences. But I'm obviously not a specialist in any of those things, but I do try to do my homework and I do try to point out the ways in which I am intervening into ongoing debates. Several that kind of frame the book here. I do want to intervene in a debate in evolutionary anthropology around the existence and prevalence of war in early hominin and or human social formations. So there's a strong school of thought that says that human altruism, or the ability for us to care about and to sacrifice for non-kin, comes with a strong in-group and out-group division where you're committed to your tribe and alienated at best or xenophobic towards outsiders. And that's formed in a evolutionary framework of rampant warfare. So the way that you can get altruism or self-sacrifice, which should have been weeded out of the process, is that in a warfare situation, those tribes or those groups of people that had a ratio of altruists to egoists would outcompete, with war being the selection pressure, those groups which were purely egoists. There's lots and lots of technical debates about whether that constitutes group selection or not, but it's a common way of looking at our ancestry, our human nature. So basically, we're the descendants of victory in warfare. Some of that victory entailed a cultural process whereby some of the people had sacrificed themselves for the victory in warfare. And that's how altruism comes from. There's a minor, to use the Deleuze and Guattari term, there's a minor science in the margins of that dominant paradigm that calls into question whether, in fact, our evolutionary environment was one of rampant, intense, and frequent warfare. And there's a lot of discussion about how to define warfare. I tend to have a kind of strict definition of warfare, that it's anonymous group violence. And there's a series of arguments why, if that's your definition, that there wasn't war as we would now know it prior to about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. So there's archaeological arguments, there's ethnographic arguments, and a number of things that I try to get into. But the book is called Regimes of Violence, so I'm not saying that no one ever hurt anyone else in human history. What I am saying is that it's not an evolutionary push towards intergroup violence, but that our human nature is open enough or plastic enough, or to use a Deleuze term, multiplicitous enough, that conditions for cooperation were just as prevalent, if not more prevalent, for conditions of warfare in the past. So that we're open to the ability to create peaceful and conditions if we can arrange to to do that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so if we zoom back a little bit, maybe Deleuzians, a few of them might be scratching their head and saying, wow, where's this coming from? So some of it might be these big debates in evolutionary psychology that you use as a foil in this chapter. Maybe most famously, where they say humanity is this killer ape, and so they have these primitive instincts that drive everything. But also I'm thinking, what are some philosophical concerns that you think this connect to, or other fields that makes this like a truly interdisciplinary intervention, even though you're mining these minor sources in such a deep and important way?
Well, thank you. I think one of the things I'm most interested in, so when I did my dive into cognitive science, I took up an active school for Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson and Esequiel Di Paolo and Hanne De Jaegher and a number of people, is sometimes seen as part of a 4EA, embodied, inactive, and extended and affective. I've always been interested in the emotional side of human life. And I think that connects with what Deleuze and Guattari call the libidinal investment in the social field. I do have a chapter that's a critique of an ideas only or belief centered notion of ideology. Criticize belief only or belief centered notions of ideology and say that the real action is in people's desires. So they constantly cite Wilhelm Reich. The masses were not fooled, they wanted fascism. We have to discover the conditions in which people want fascism. Deleuze and Guattari tie that back to Spinoza, which they call the Spinoza question. Under what conditions will men fight for their servitude as much as for their liberation? When we talk about affect, I do want to resurrect or emphasize the possibilities for joy. But joy is very tricky, right? Because you can have passive joy. The Nazis and fascists are overflowing with joy. If you look at the January 6th invasion of the Capitol, people were having absolutely the time of their lives. So I try to distinguish between an active, joyous encounter, which increases the potentials for increasing positive affect on both sides of the equation. So I turn someone on who can turn someone on so that they can expand their affective range, which means that they can be influenced by and influence others in a wider variety of ways. Being a joy guy, I don't want to deny that fascism is full of joy. I think the difference is it's a kind of joy of being taken up into a mass, the movement. So there's a connection there with a kind of Freud and Gustave Le Bon fear of the crowd that intersects with a really wonderful book by Jeremy Gilbert on collective politics and how you can have collective politics that is transversal, to use the jargon, rather than hierarchical or even just flatly horizontal. That also picks up with another book that I really enjoy by Rodrigo Nunez called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal. So I do think there are connections with a lot of this stuff towards political theory or even activist stuff. One last thing, then, I think that the chapter I have on marronage, which is people fleeing enslavement. Marronage has been taken up as a contemporary term for temporary autonomous zones and squatters and hackers and a wide-ranging range of contemporary social formation experimentation as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that gives a very synoptic overview of a lot of the, say, greatest hits that come in the book. And it has four parts, and it really opens with human nature and your intervention in human nature there, which I think is absolutely crucial for setting up everything else. Part two is on political psychology, where you have these like two contrasting cases, both Berserkers and Esprit de Corps, which began as essays a bit ago, but you've updated and sort of deepened those connections, and I really appreciate that. The section you just mentioned on marronage comes through a political anthropology and case for statification as a concept. And then, it ends with those two events, the Capitol invasion as well as COVID-19. And so I think in that way, it feels like social theory written by someone who really dug into the connection to cognition or other sciences, but then, of course, you're a philosopher by training as well. So it's really this excellent interdisciplinary work that goes across so many different avenues. And I think that that's maybe something that makes Deleuzean inquiry maybe not completely unique, but it picks up this French philosophy of science tradition that maybe other people departed from. They, in the analytic tradition, I think through philosophy of mind or cognition, they've always sort of kept the sciences pretty close. Maybe philosophy isn't the queen of the sciences anymore, but it's still in the mix. Whereas for other approaches, science is really held at arm's length and a distance. So maybe just as like a very big question, like what do you see the connection between philosophical inquiry or even these social and political questions and how Deleuzians can and should approach scientific questions or scientific literatures?
Okay, well that's a big one. Let me start by going into the specific thing about human nature. The concept of human nature has been used either as an exclusionary or hierarchizing, if that's a word, concept for a long, long time. So I do use the Deleuzean term of a multiplicity when I talk about human nature. And I also do think that my entire career is a kind of multiplicity, where I try to see the ways in which these things might possibly hang together. Now, I wrote this book, the chapters independently, but then spent a lot of time trying to weave them together, not not into a coherent narrative, but I usually use the image of an overlapping sheaf of investigations. My initial entry into all this was reading Manuel DeLanda years and years ago. His book, War in the Age of Intelligent Machines, and also 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. So he explicated what's called either complexity theory or dynamic systems theory. And so there's a kind of translation you can do of Deleuze's terminology of singularity, for instance, is like a turning point or a threshold or a singularity in dynamic systems terms. So that was really my entry. And then I did get interested in the inactive science thing of trying to work against the notion of a subject who represents the world to him or herself in a kind of picture capture representation. Nonetheless, that was Varela, Thompson, and Roche in The Embodied Mind. I really try to show the way in which cognition should best be modeled as an organism navigating its world. And its world has to be both salience, that has to mean something to the thing, and there has to be valences, that the world shows up as a push or a pull, as an attraction or a repulsion. So that got me thinking then, well, how did we evolve as human beings on this inactive intellect and emotion together, affective, valence and salience and valence kind of way? What is the world that we've constructed? And that takes me into Anti-Oedipus. It's kind of mashup, I think, of Bataille's, we got to get rid of this extra solar energy. Nietzsche, will to power. Everybody's trying to make larger and larger complexes. And Spinoza's naturing nature, and natura naturans. And so each social formation has to channel this energy because otherwise the energy would just run smoothly, and which for them would be no society at all. So you have to have some channeling. So then I got to thinking, well, what Deleuze and Guattari call libidinal investment in the socius, in the ways in which your society channels this energy. That sounds like it's at least compatible with a being who has to live in a world in which there's salience and valence. Things have to matter to it. So that got me thinking about human beings and how did we evolve such that things matter to us, even when it's social patterns or justice for third parties. Right? So it's very well established in biology that animals will fight for their kin. If you do a gene reduction thing, you're going to pass on part of your gene, so you can sacrifice yourself for your children or for people who are closely related to you. And that's certainly the case with human beings. They will fight more ferociously for their kin than for non-kin. But we also fight for justice. We also care about justice. I've got all these things bubbling away that I'm trying to bring together. So the mashup would be human beings evolved as affective creatures who care for the social patterns they're involved in. And I think that goes really deep biologically, because we know that social isolation will completely screw up your oxytocin levels, your serotonin levels, your cortisol levels. So it's as deep as possible that if you're not socially connected, right, that you will suffer. I think that's the way that human beings evolved, in a social framework that will channel your desire, your libidinal investment in particular ways. When we get to capitalism, though, following Deleuze and Guattari's thing in Anti-Oedipus, we tend to break down a lot of the previous codes. All that is solid melts into air, which Marx kind of celebrates as an opportunity to get away from the bishop doesn't have to approve your startup company anymore by seeing whether it aligns with natural law. What an opportunity! I do think that Deleuze and Guattari do share that ambivalent relationship to capitalism that it does by decoding. It offers opportunities, but by immediately recoding on private property and re-territorializing on the family, you end up owing not gifts to your neighbors, as in what they call primitive society, or tribute to the emperor in the imperial society, but you owe your life to capital because you have to work in order to eat. And you owe an eternal debt of neurosis to your family because your desire has been territorialized into the nuclear family. Now, it's very quick and there's lots of nuances. For me, that's an interesting way to try to find a way that you can create social conditions that would allow for experimentation. Deleuze and Guattari use art in a very extended sense to mean sports, which is one of my chapters.
I mean, the impressive breadth of this argument is something that I think people will find really refreshing, because we live in such an era of hyperspecialization that big ideas have been left to Niall Ferguson trying to justify, empire, or, maybe the Graeber Wengrow book, which you worked through a bit. That's really nice. But Steven Pinker, or even, these Homo sapiens arguments that I think by making them like popular or easy to consume, they really don't challenge much common sense, and they don't give a very sophisticated picture. And so for you, I think the ambition is where it starts, and it's really refreshing. And for me, the thing that I see in it that maybe you don't see as clearly because you're working from this joyous perspective is also the line of unbecoming. I mean, right when you start talking about capitalism, it's like that's where it becomes really important for DNG. But of course, in what is philosophy, for them, there's this absolute speed of thought that is this deterritorializing process, and you can sort of reach into the transformative power of the chaosmos. I think it definitely begins with this materialist impulse that DNG already start in Anti-Oedipus by saying that they're doing a material psychiatry and they're going to look at some anthropological sources. Of course, they're also leaning heavily on Marx himself, who sort of promoted materialism as the only way to really do transformative social thought. They combine it with Freud, who maybe in a certain way already had a sort of materialism to it, but it leans towards free and detached libido by the time you get to Marcuse or someone else who wants to find the eros tendency in like a libidinal economy. Each one of your chapters plays in this sort of like structure, and it's undoing a little bit as well. Human nature, affective ideology. But then the unbecoming sort of really starts showing up with Berserkers, right? Where they lose their mind and they go into this state of amnesia. But then the opposite of that you pose to it is Esprit de Corps, where you sort of lose yourself in the group as well. And you sort of maintain your own singularity a bit. But it's really this sort of trans-individuated formation of the nomad, at least in Thousand Plateaus. And then in the anthropology section, statification, which itself is like this hierarchy process, but then marinage, it's the flee away from it, it's the undoing, it's this disruption of the settled calcified structure of the state. And then with political events, I don't know, it's a little bit more complicated with the capital invasion and then COVID, and you treat this really tragic case of a health worker who passed. So maybe I can provocatively ask you sort of, You found the structure, you find the development. Where's the unbecoming, or where's the transformation that's happening in each one of these processes that you find in the very materialist circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I have mainstream narratives that I try to undercut. I'll give one example in the human nature chapter. There's a curious absence of discussions of joy in a lot of evolutionary anthropology when it comes to food sharing. Right? So, food sharing is a resource variance insurance. So, if you kill a wildebeest and it's too big to eat among your small group, then you invite your neighbors over. However, they never say it's really fun to have a barbecue. It's just really striking. So that might be one of the places that I kind of unravel it. The mainstream narrative does tend to reduce things to survival. And that picks up the Nietzschean thing about his critique of Darwin. Everything comes down to a reactive survival thing. There's nothing about the sheer exuberance of having fun. There's this curious utilitarian twist to that too, however, because as I do not think that life would have been worth living for our ancestors were they not able to find joy. So,
It just shows how far conversations of pre-state human life have moved the center of gravity from structuralist anthropology, or even Levi-Strauss in particular. I was reading the old translation. There's a new translation of Wild Thought.
yeah.
And for him, symbolic life is just as original and probably even pre-human as anything else. And there are other anthropologists who occasionally get sort of thrown into the mix. But when you read archaeology literature, which is often where this stuff happens in the sort of expanded anthropological field, there are people who are very much natural determinists. And so they have this almost strict Darwinian framework of which everything is about survival and or reproduction. And for the Levi-Straussian stuff for a while, it was like, well, sure, those things might be fulfilled, but in the same way in which a Freudian or a Lacanian would say that your needs are fulfilled, which is through a very elliptical, socially mediated process. And so, they focused on things like marriage prohibitions, which,
Mhm.
of course, the classic line is, that you oblige more than you prohibit. It's really just
Mhm.
this impulse to have more exogamous and outgroup sort of relations. I was even reading some of the older Marxist anthropology on this, like Claude Meillassoux, and he talks about how there's often a prohibition of internal clan consumption of meat for the hunt,
Mhm.
where the hunter themselves don't get to eat the thing that they capture.
Or at least they don't get to distribute it.
Sure. Yeah. And so there are all these interesting elements that I think that the mainstream account just doesn't even look at. And so because you're able to work on these multiple registers, I think that it's bringing in a much more complicated picture than many of them are able to do. And so we get to something like, I don't know, Berserker or Esprit de Corps. Do you want to talk about them? Because I think they're
Yeah.
such important figures.
Yeah. No. So the Berserkers has fascinated me for a long time. It's a multiplicity. I think that in my reading of the anthropological literature, following some of the military science stuff that I've read, it does seem to be difficult, except for a very small percentage of cold-blooded killers, to kill at close range, hand to hand, and in cold blood. So for militaries to increase the ability of their fighters to engage in mortal combat, have to find ways to break the one-on-one and have group solidarity, have to find ways to break the distance. So spears are easier than knives, which are easier than hands, and on to the point where you just press a button. There's a very interesting turnaround with drone pilots because they don't have a kill or be killed excuse, and yet they can see close up their victims.
And this is deterritorialization, right? In the same way in which Deleuze says, oh, okay, when humans or, actually pre-humans stop walking on all fours, they have their hands and suddenly they start using technology. And so each one of these is a sort of deterritorialization.
Yeah, but you get these twists and turns. The other thing, then, you have to have distance, you have to have group solidarity, you end up with a lot of dehumanization, and then you end up with ways to incite rage or the appropriate level of rage. So, for hand to hand, open field skirmishing, a berserker rage is very effective, as the Vikings showed, right? You've so blown up your system that you just tapping into a mammalian prey reaction. Predators are cold compared to berserkers. Berserkers work themselves into a way in which they become prey so that they're lashing out, cornered prey, so they lash out at anything that's close to them. That's not a predator thing. They're cool, calm, and collected. We could go back and reread each of the kills in the Iliad to see who was a berserker and who was a predator. The twist, though, comes in modern warfare, especially in the American imperial regime of violence. You don't want berserkers. They're identified and weeded out as early as possible. The famous SEAL Team 6, you did not want any berserkers in that because you had to be cool and collected and follow the checklist. So berserkers are, again, it's a multiplicity. They're not good in all forms of warfare, but they are good in some forms of warfare. And the danger is they could get triggered even when you have a highly trained military person in the imperial regime of violence. So I do a case study of this guy in Afghanistan, Robert Bales, who had a berserker reaction and killed a bunch of villagers. And it created a scandal because we were supposed to do hearts and minds and counterinsurgency and all sorts of things that doesn't fit with berserking. Then the other side, so the Esprit de Corps was close to my heart. I wanted to do something about sports after 40 years of being a philosopher. So I looked at a wonderful goal in the 2011 Women's World Cup when Megan Rapinoe crossed the ball to Abby Wambach, and they scored a wonderful goal after 120 minutes of awesome exertion. So when I look at what was not necessarily the escape from subjectivity, but the way in which the joint effort also produces a non-utilitarian joy. So to go back to chapter 1, there is a way in which you can give an adaptationist reading of joy that people who seem happy will attract more mates. But that, I think, is kind of third-party observation. So when you're together with people in a second-person relationship, you have a shared joy in the efforts that you're expending in the training and in the game. Sports people often, almost always say, the thing I miss about being a retired athlete is the camaraderie, the shared exertion of training. It's also fun to connect with somebody and make the pass that enables them to score. You're supporting their relational autonomy. I have to make my own decision that enables you to make your own decisions. But the pass is what links the two players together. So you have to give the ball up. I mean, only Messi and Maradona were good enough to dribble the whole length of the field. Everyone else has to pass. The pass constitutes the passer and the receiver. It's the medium that creates the endpoints. That's the trans-individuation bit. That was not quite self-indulgent, but for me to write that sports chapter because it's been a huge part of my life. And I was really glad to be able to bring some philosophy to bear on it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know sports is such a great example, too. In some ways, it's a sublimation of conflict or even war. And so it actually fits quite well with Berserker. And I think the interesting part about Berserker, too, especially if you bring it back to DNG's sort of metaphysics, is that, for them, war isn't always negative, especially when it's used as an anti-state force among non-state peoples in order to disaccumulate power. And so, it's not this simple idea of just like a pacifist who's saying, berserkers are this thing we need to be really worried about, but also the professionalized military. It becomes, a really complex sort of schema, I guess. And I'm just struck that in our political moment, institutions are becoming challenged from this sort of like unrestrained, excessive politics, and that people who are professional civil servants or professional long-term federal agency workers, professional military generals, it was like the incoming political officials do not have the proper constitution or they don't have the proper mood. And, we see political rallies acting like nothing that we've ever seen before. But I think you already find this in the Capitol invasion chapter, in which you're really trying to figure out, what was going on there? What actually happened? What did it look like? Doesn't fit what we usually think of as the pretty buttoned up idea of what American politics, focusing on procedure and process and these voting, and maybe there's a little lobbying going on or something, but it's usually within a pretty expected regime where you can just read a couple headlines and feel like you know what's going on. But it's like the Financial Times might actually not have a better read of the situation sometimes now, because things have gotten so different. It's not just this like very functionalist material base anymore.
I mean, in one sense, it's going back to Keynes and animal spirits, and the stock market is an emotional weather report, to kind of mishmash Tom Waits in there. I might be one of the few people who have put Tom Waits and John Maynard Keynes in the same sentence. One of the things that certainly, to come back to Deleuze and Guattari, they talk about the voluptuous waves of libidinal investment that flow across the stock market. One of the ones in which they say that even the most disadvantaged creature gets a thrill at the waves of capital that are moving around the planet, which is kind of true, because I remember before I even had any investments, feeling good when the TV news would say, hey, the stock market's up. Side note, one of the greatest tricks of capitalism is to make professionals dependent upon the stock market for their retirement. I know a lot more about investments now than I ever thought I would have to. Now, COVID, yes, I think that those things come together because of debt and the way in which, picking up a really nice book by Lisa Atkins called The Time of Money, she emphasizes now that people really are working not paycheck to paycheck, because they don't consume their paycheck. They're working in order to have a paycheck that they can then present as collateral for credit, which they actually live on the credit. So companies aren't interested in you paying off your bill every month. They want the ongoing debt. So that connects back to debt as Deleuze and Guattari's main thing, with debt in primitive society, debt to the emperor, debt to capitalism. This is a refinement of that. So we are responsible then for financing our own lives through taking on debt. And then we were made responsible for making our own virus risk assessments. So the one particular case that I looked at, a woman named Shenetta White-Ballard, but she had to balance going to work in a nursing home full of COVID patients, her viral risk, with her financial risk. If she didn't have the paycheck that enables her to pay off the minimum amount to keep her credit running, then there would have been a financial catastrophe for her house. And so that was a double bind. And I tried to look at what in cognitive science is called the predictive brain thesis, or the predictive processing, whereby we're constantly making predictions, and then sensory information is a reduction in the error of the prediction that we make. And that is said to save us the time and effort by making these predictions of getting real world feedback. You can run a hypothetical. But when you're in a no-win situation, you're caught in a loop of predicting a future that you cannot possibly get out of, right? Because it's a double bind. And that itself has deleterious, wearing physiological effects, because one of the ways in which that actually works is there's a number of neurotransmitters that lower the synapse level so you can think faster and harder, but that actually wears you out, especially in, at least picking up the thesis of weathering by Arlene Geronimus, who talks about what's called the telomere, which is telomere, which is at the end of your chromosomes. And each time you have a cell division, it protects the interior coding part of the chromosome. But that gets worn down, and there's an accelerated wearing down, or an accelerated aging, her claim is, for people in racialized and gendered subject positions in American society. So it may have been the case that this person, who was a person of color, a woman of color in her 40s, may have already been affected by American racism, as to the point where physiologically her resistance might have been lessened. But it's impossible to know what the length of your telomeres are. Right? You can't reflect on that, so that doesn't really feed into the her calculations. But so you end up in this kind of ruminating state, constantly going over the scenarios. Do I have enough risk? What am I risking by going to work? What am I risking by not having enough to pay my debts? And there's no win for that. And that itself wears you out. Right? So that was the kind of horrible double bind that I tried to see, that she and many other people who were deemed essential workers either had to go to work or risked losing their jobs.
That's one of the great shames of the American way of life and the healthcare system in particular, that we get a pretty consistent number. Like between 1998 and 2020, there are over 1 million what they call excess deaths of African Americans due to a variety of factors around inadequate healthcare access and other really unfortunate structural causes.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I really appreciate in your work. You do mention and talk to Liz about the shame at being human that Deleuze and Guattari talk about in What is Philosophy?
And if I'm remembered correctly, it's a reference to Primo Levi on the sort of shame of being a survivor of a great catastrophe like the camps and the Holocaust. And there are all kinds of catastrophes we've lived through since that we have to come to grips with the fact that we've survived, but maybe for reasons that weren't available to others, and that's a deep social question. I'm also reminded of two references. There's these very brief and cryptic references to the work of de Brunhoff in Deleuze and Guattari's work about the function of money. And I think it's been republished by Verso recently. And while it's not exactly the same, I think it's very close to this finance and monetary credit system that you were talking about, where it's not even people's salary that is most significant. They're living off money and credit instead.
Well, there's one person I would mention here. I do not think he's published too much in English, but it's a French philosopher named Quentin Badaire. He has a magnificent 800-page French thesis, PhD thesis, on Deleuze and Guattari's use of social science. So he's a real expert on all three sections of Anti-Oedipus and the anthropological and economic economists that they use.
His book review of James C. Scott's Against the Grain is really excellent.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's come back to the statification thing if we could. I do try to look at what they say about capture, which is the way in which a society has to equal out, this is the imperial society, has to equal out heterogeneous activities as labor, has to equal out land productivity as rents, and has to equal out exchange capacities as money, tax. So there's a whole complicated thing there. But that presupposes a primary violence of what Marx calls primitive accumulation, which Deleuze and Guattari generalize to say that whenever there's capture, whenever there's a state that imposes its form of life on non-state peoples, there's going to be primitive accumulation, and that's a prior violence. So that connects up with Benjamin and the divine violence stuff, and also Derrida. But what I always wanted to see in both of those is that as soon as there's a state, there's people running from the state. And then that's the marriage, and that's one of Scott's things. So that makes a really complicated multiplicity because geography has to figure in. How close are you to the imperial center? That means it's less costly for the imperial center to send its tax collectors and its armies. Right? The further you are away, not just in distance, but the closer you are to the hills, right? That means it's more difficult for state pursuing troops or infantry or at best cavalry to follow you. So the old advice of run for the hills is absolutely literally true. So the twist that brings the two things together, I think, is that the Maroons, in establishing themselves in a place close to the state, because they're not anti-state, but they want an independence from the state so that they can prey upon the state if they need to, or trade with the state, or even have a treaty with the state. But they have to do that in such a way that it would impose an unacceptable cost on the pursuers, the state pursuers, to actually come and bring them back. The epigraph for the Marinage chapter is from the American Black radical George Jackson. I may be running, but all the while I'll be looking for a stick, a defensible position, which Deleuze mangles slightly by saying I'll be looking for a gun. That's because of the translation, the French translation of George Jackson. So the final turn of the thing is that sometimes Maroons, I think, might themselves come back and conquer the state and stay in the state. So in Deleuze-Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, they make a lot about Nietzsche's line about they come as if from nowhere. They're too hostile and foreign even to be hated. They arrive as with lightning and take over the state. I don't see why that couldn't also be Maroons who've grown up, honed their fighting skills, lived a non-state life, and then found the weakness in the state that they're attacking in order to be free, and thought, well, why don't we just stay and ourselves become state form, become the state form, except we'll be at the top, not our ancestors at the bottom who ran away, but we'll come back and do that. There's very little evidence of that kind of thing, but I think it fits the framework that Deleuze and Guattari lay out, and it does connect with what Scott said about the non-state peoples who are in constant interaction with the state. And in fact, both of them are codependent. The state needs the non-state people for the raw materials and the jewels and the slaves that the non-state people can capture and bring into the state as well. So it's a big multiplicity. I tried to distinguish different regimes of violence. The primary regime of violence of statification, which installs capture, such that theft becomes a crime against the state, and the police will go after that. But that's only after the primary primitive accumulation or the primary violence. And the Maroons have their own form of regime of violence. They're very unforgiving of deserters. They're also a little suspicious of people that they captured in one of their periodic raids and would capture them. They needed to go through a seasoning process or an acclimation process of living free for several years before they would be trusted. They were kept as kind of household servants, whereas they were very accepting of people who actually ran away themselves. So that was the kind of proof that you wanted to live free, was that you got there to the Maroon community. Whereas if you had to go in and you had to be taken there on a raid, you had to prove yourself. Right? So that's a regime of violence there.
Yeah, I mean, to talk about that final turn that you mentioned, in which a non-state people might actually return to settle the state, um, if you do the very long history of state formation, this is actually common in a number of instances. To use one that's close to, Deleuze and Guattari's heart, um, the city-state of Ur in the Sumerian Empire. We're thinking circa about 2000 BC, but it had been around for maybe about 1500 years prior to that as well. There's the final fall of Sumer, and there's even a lament for it and everything. And they'd fought off some nomadic people from what is now the southeastern mountains of Turkey, where they got their wood and cedar. But the people from the northeast that eventually helped contribute to their demise, who are the Martu, themselves were a nomadic raiding people. And after you have the fall of Ur, in part they're the Elamites too, who are like from Iran. But once the Martu like conquer the cities, they settle them and live in them for themselves for quite a while. And then become sort of institutionalized. Or like there's a whole series of rulers in the ancient Egyptian empire who were from foreign regions. They conquer, and instead of imposing their own culture on it, they assimilate into Egyptian culture. So there, all these like fun's not the right word here. There are all these unexpected and curious examples. And I think that's what's so important about returning this material, because there's such a hegemony of a modern and liberal jurisprudence approach to how social and political change happens. And it imagines that it happens by rotating who's in office and gets to set policy. Occasionally, it's by some unexpected people from below seizing the institutions and turning it to their advantage. But The maroon gives us a completely different schema for political transformation, and that it's one first of just subtraction or elimination. It sort of starves the beast, as it were. But then you're right. I mean, it's not always normatively good. People can reestablish a state, and perhaps even a more brutal one in the process. The other thing about this different political schema is, D&G are sort of ironically playing on Henry Louis Morgan's anthropology that was then, obviously quite complicated, way too evolutionary in its path, deterministic. And then when Engels got a hold of it, under the influence of social Darwinism, creates a very challenging framework that its basic idea is that, there's a history to the creation of the family, private property, and the states. And then all three of those will have to be challenged and undermined for a successful socialist or even ideally, communist transformation. But then all of the methodology behind it has been undermined since. And so I think you take a really helpful path that just dispenses with trying to have a tortured reworking of it and finds a much more productive political avenue.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the first thing we have to do is get away from any progressivism, depending on how horrific you paint the state of nature in Hobbes, or merely just a bad business environment, as with Locke. The only rational move really is to join civil society, is to sign the social contract and either delegate to the sovereign or become part of the sovereign. Or at least have a limited sovereign. We know all the permutations of that. But that neglects the fact that specifically slaves are encasted as the outside within the social contract. Right? They're not covered. They're not citizens. They don't sign the contract, but they're encasted within it as the outside that could be killed with impunity. And then we could move to the necropolitics and Bembe and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. So of course, the slave wants to escape. The only rational move for an enslaved person is to flee that territory governed by that social contract and run for the hills. You just have to use the economic principle of the revealed preferences to see that when people run away from the state, they're showing their position within the so-called social contract. It's better in the woods. There's a wonderful article by Daniel Lubin called Hobbesian Slavery, in which he talks about the way in which the right to rebellion is one of the inalienable rights if you're put in a position in which your life is not worth living, he says. They are still in a state of nature, hence all means are open to them of recourse, so that an enslaved person cannot commit a murder, right? Because they're in the state of nature, and murder is only a crime in a civil society. So Hobbes, along this reading, is really very interesting, right? Enslaved people cannot murder their captors. They can kill them in order to escape, but because they're not part of the social contract, they're not bound by the civil society because they never agreed to it, and hence, so that's a regime of violence that includes killing but not murder. So that's one of the things when I use the big framework of regime of violence. I'm not a bad Rousseau reader in the sense that people think that Rousseau said that the state of nature was nice or something. She doesn't really say that. The first part of the discourse on inequality is probably a hypothetical of what would have been necessary in order to produce human beings, and human beings only appear in the beginning of the second part of the discourse on inequality, and there's plenty of violence there. But it's just as any social formation must channel its desiring production, so must any socius or any social formation must channel its violence. Within a slaveholding society, you are granted impunity in rendering violent acts against slaves. And the thing that makes the whole system tremble is the slave who kills the master. So it's regulated in that way as part of what provokes response. Having a regime of violence doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. You can't have free-for-alls. Any social formation has to regulate desiring production, which you can cash out in terms of who gets to hook up with who gets to eat what, who gets free time in order to make things, who has to owe a certain amount to somebody else, and who gets to hit who.
And speaking of insult and injury, one of my favorite dimensions of non-state people's lives too is the organized use of insult or heckling in order to disaccumulate power as well. Someone is getting a little too powerful or a little too independent or something like that, then boy, do they get all the insults heaped on them until they're taken down a few notches in the social ranking. So maybe thinking about the thing that makes the system tremble in a slave owning society is the slave who strikes back, and that's why it's so deeply regulated. It also makes me think the way to get away with it is to do it and then disappear or have this basis outside of it, which at least to me brings back the darkness of the dark Deleuze, or the unintelligible, or the space of the outside. But for you, maybe it leads us to the conclusion on the joyousness as well. So maybe we can have you give your final case for the joy, which, by the way, just if people are listening at home, I always say that it's an asymmetric contrast from the joy. It's not meant to be some sort of complete opposite. There is a space for joy in the darkness, maybe even a joy division. But John, give us your case for the joy.
Well, I mean, I set the whole thing up by saying it's ambivalent. There's all sorts of passive joy. So I do try to run the Spinoza line that you cannot have active sadness, right? Because an active relationship is going to build up your power. Your power means your ability to be affected and to affect others. So insofar as you understand your contribution to an encounter, right, that is a amplification of, it's an expression of your power and an amplification of your affective spread, and that cannot be sad, as he says. But you can have passive joy, and that's the danger of being swept away by the mob or whatever. So while I don't accept Le Bon's phobia about all crowds and all mobs, I am worried about crowds and mobs.
So in the conclusion, you tie this to anti-fascism. So maybe this is the culminating point on that too.
So I've always been really struck by Foucault's preface to the English translation, published by University of Minnesota Press, of Anti-Oedipus. And there he has some wonderful things warning to, we must defeat the desires described as the fascism in us all, in our hearts and our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. Foucault continues by saying, be multiple, not totalizing, never terrorize your readers, never claim to have found the pure order, be joyous, do not think one has to be sad to be militant, do not become enamored of power. I do then distinguish active joy from passive joy in the Spinozist connection. So the passive joy comes from being taken up outside yourself into the mob, transfixed by the leader. But active joy is in a network situation in which you turn on someone who enables them to turn on other people. So let me read this here. I propose an ethical standard. Does the encounter produce repeatable, mutually active, joyous affect in enacting positive care and cooperation? And then I do end up saying something like, we're at a turning point, an inflection point with regard to the challenge to liberalism posed by the worldwide turn to fascism, and the question of whether we can reform liberalism in a democratic socialist manner quickly enough and radically enough to enable us to deal with climate change, mass incarceration, debt servitude, both of the third world and of the mass of people in the United States? Or do we have to institute a revolutionary regime of violence against the fascism that we see arrayed against us? That's not up for me to decide. That will be decided in the streets, or if we last long enough in 2026 and 2028 in the next two presidential elections. But we're not going to get there as long as the Harris, Biden, Obama wing of the Democratic Party insists on being more afraid of losing their donors than of losing an election. So, final thing, American regime of violence has been hit with a lightning bolt by Luigi Mangione, who assassinated in a classic propaganda of the deed, direct action, right from 1900. He shot a CEO on the streets of Manhattan. Is that going to shock and galvanize the American people enough to pressure the Democratic Party? I kind of doubt it, because everything we've seen so far has either been kind of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying something like, this is not to justify the murder, but I understand where he's coming from, which is fine. You have to distinguish explanation from justification. But that was an event whose reverberations through the American political system and its ability to capture those events and encapsulate them and render them neutral, or whether it will reverberate around. But there's a lot of scared establishment folks. It's a structure, right? You can kill the CEO. There's a new CEO in place, but it's not to justify it, but it has to be explained. And in order to understand, I do think you have to have at least some ability to enter the world of the perpetrator of the deed in order to find out his motivations.
Yeah, right before you ended, I was thinking maybe we're in a Timothy Leary or Malcolm X situation, and either turn on, tune in, drop out, or by any means necessary. But now I'm hearing echoes of Lucy Gonzalez Parsons, whose husband was executed as one of the Haymarket martyrs in Chicago. Her famous words, "Let every dirty, lousy tramp arm himself with a revolver or knife and lay in wait in the steps of the palaces of the rich and stab or shoot the owners as they come out." Maybe it's not 1887 again, but it is a point in which this new Gilded Age, there's a new version of fascism, and something's going to change, and hopefully for the better.
Yep. Yeah, yep.
Well, thanks, John. I mean, your book's going to be a wonderful resource in helping think about this moment, other ones in the past, but hopefully some new and more interesting, or at least creative anti fascist ones in the future. And I invite everyone to please check out the book.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And no, I'm looking forward to the conversations that I hope will be sparked by this book.
Yeah, and thanks, Maggie, and everyone else at University of Minnesota Press for making this possible and all the wonderful work that they do.
Yes, 100%. It's we can't do it without a lot of help.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. The book Regimes of Violence Toward a Political Anthropology by John Protevi is available from University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for listening.